Welcome back and to Mapping the Shadow. So today we're going to be moving in a slightly new direction, but certainly building on all the content that's come so far. We're going to be talking about Hegel's Master-Slave dynamic, specifically applied to the modern age, how it looks today, how it shows up in today's world. And this is very relevant to this whole subject of freedom and self-becoming and the shadow map. The ideas of power and freedom are absolutely fundamental to this whole model. If you want to understand a more basic understanding of the shadow map, then I suggest going back to the very first episode and watching that. But assuming that you're pretty much up to speed on that, and even if you aren't, if you just want to delve in here, I hope that you still get something out of this. And, this map, the whole point of it actually is that it's reflecting certain truths about the nature of mind. So rather than having to get really detailed about it now, I think there's a secondary purpose here in just looking at it and understanding it intuitively as well as intellectually. So there's a place for both. There's utility to both. And so with that sentiment, the master-slave dynamic. Remember in the last few episodes we talked about evil and the self-contradictory nature of evil, and also the role of suffering and how suffering is the experience of energetic tension. So the master-slave dynamic is another kind of tension. It's a very core piece of Hegel's philosophy. And in a nutshell, it comes about because self-consciousness needs to realize itself through recognition, and in its primary stages is relating to the world in such a way that it's trying to consume and negate the objects of the world. And so at a certain rudimentary stage, it's considering other people in that same light. So almost by default, in fact, Hegel believed this was a necessary stage, and it is a necessary stage, but to what extent it becomes cemented and persists is another question. It must eventually be overcome through the combination of negation, because it's an unsustainable situation, but also, make no mistake, the free will of those involved in it. So, in essence, what happens is that when two self-determining minds meet and they haven't been through this process, or they haven't overcome this process, the inclination is to try and dominate. It's to try and attain self-determination at the expense of the other, not because of evil in itself necessarily, but because it's seen as a means to one's own self-determination and realization. Of course, this is, hopefully is clear to you that this is a completely flawed way of approaching life, let alone relationships. But at a certain point, it does seem necessary. And we've all been here at a certain stage in our lives, and maybe still do this in certain pockets or facets of our lives. Maybe you're still doing this in some way. This isn't like some linear or singular moment or process. It's an overarching process, but it's also something that happens in various different ways at different times. Perhaps you've realized it in some areas of your life, perhaps there's other ways in which you haven't yet realized it. Hence why coming to understand it at an overarching level is really important. And so this initial dynamic sets up because both parties, presumably, are trying to gain that self-determination. And if the other person has to be thrown by the wayside in pursuit of that, so be it. But it can also happen because one party in this interaction isn't actually interested in subjugating the other. So on some level, they will be at some point, according to Hegel. But for many of you, this is probably something that you've sort of seen through, but haven't necessarily seen through a later point, which is the need of actually embodying your own ability to push back and to fight and to set boundaries. So, in other words, it can happen as a result of trying to engage in a dynamic and either so-called succeeding as the master or failing as the slave. Or it can come about, or something like this can come about, because you've seen through the master-slave dynamic, but haven't yet seen the need to set boundaries in a full way, an adequate way. So essentially what ensues is a life or death struggle, and one party tends to come out on top, and the other party tends to go, you know what, I'd rather live, it's better to live as a slave, at least for now, than to die and hence that other party becomes the slave. Now, Hegel's original terminology for this was something more like the Lord and Bondsman dialectic. Many people call it the Master-Slave dynamic now, but the Lord and Bondsman clearly alludes to a sort of feudal age type arrangement. It's not only existing in the feudal ages, but that's how Hegel was exemplifying it. And so for those watching a video here, I've actually got an image of two guys in a field, and one sort of crouching down in front of the other, and the other one standing in front of him with a stick. So presumably he's wielding power over the guy crouching down and forcing him to work his land for him. But this is an unstable situation. So first of all, let's just pause here, because is there anything you can see in this that you recognize in your own life or in the structure of society more widely? Like, where do you see this unfolding? I've given some clues here. Do you feel that you've engaged with this dynamic yourself? Are you, in some areas, or maybe in the sort of overarching theme of your life, are you perpetuating this dynamic in some way, either as the master or the slave? Do you consciously or unconsciously wish to be a master? Do you get something out of being a slave? Is there some kind of apparent relief in that? The security from not having to do the work of embracing and accepting yourself fully, opting instead just to do the will of others. So where do you see this playing out, either in your life or in the world that you see around you? I've obviously given some clues here in the title of this video and also in the imagery that I'm using, but just more on that. The reason this is an unsustainable situation, well, many reasons, but some of the main ones are that, well, simply put, the recognition that the master craves from the outside world, i.e. the slave in this case, is unsatisfactory, because essentially the master has dominated the slave, and therefore the only person in the world who actually recognizes him as a free autonomous being is themselves not fully free or autonomous by the master's own doing. So it's like he actually loses a kind of respect for the slave. There may be a kind of respect there, but actually on some level he's disappointed because he's not getting the full recognition from a free autonomous being. So the recognition from the one who is not free or is not individuated or whole with themselves does not have the full effect of what the master really craved. And hence the master himself is not free. He's not free in the way he wants to be, or perhaps at certain moments thought he was, or that he craves to be, or even has the potential to be. So that's one side of the dynamic here, the dialectic, is that the recognition provided by the so-called slave to the master is insufficient and unsatisfactory. And so in effect, the master is sort of hanging out with an idea of freedom, but really it's more power. Like, power kind of looks like freedom, right? Can do. That's why it's so tempting, why it's so tantalizing. You have power over everything. That's a kind of freedom, right? Well, sorta, except that it's actually partial. It's not freedom for the precise reasons delineated by Hegel's master-slave dynamic. It's not freedom because you have power over things, seemingly, that you don't actually get recognition from. You don't come to recognize yourself in those things because you yourself are subjugating them as the master. But the other side of the coin here pertains to the slave. The slave who ostensibly is inferior, weaker, maybe less popular, less intelligent. It doesn't matter what the quality is. It shows up in all kinds of ways. The slave who is having his own recognition plundered, whether forcibly, whether through coercion, whether through laws, whether through cultural pressures, expectations, whether through one-sided power grabs and various other unfair arrangements, doesn't really matter. You can talk about this and reshape this in any kind of way. But any situation where there's an imbalance of recognition is essentially a master-slave dynamic. Doesn't mean the slave isn't in some way culpable themselves, either through will or through ignorance, for their own situation. But like all things, it's a dialectic, right? So there's truth and value on both sides. But this so-called slave who is subjugated actually starts to develop a kind of self-recognition, because they start to produce things. They're doing work for the master, whether it's working in a field, whether it's working in an office, whether it's solving problems for a company, whatever it might be. So in short, the slave is starting to recognize themselves through their labor and through their creation. They're actually becoming more and more self-realized through their own sub-dynamic, if you like, of seeing themselves created in the world. And so this starts to build a kind of self-esteem and a degree of self-knowledge, not to mention a degree of competence for which they can gain recognition. And so there's this other side to the coin here, where actually the slave in some way is actually becoming more developed than the master in another kind of way, and an all the more important way. So this whole dynamic starts to become unstable, and eventually it will break down one way or another, unless it's just perpetuated indefinitely for as long as these people live. But that itself is unsustainable, even if they're able to sustain it for their own lifetimes. It means exerting a tremendous amount of energy, an ever increasing amount of energy as time in life goes on, and also not reaching their potential in the process, not adhering to their essence or realizing their essence in life, and not gaining self-knowledge, not integrating the shadow, never really understanding what true love and connection are, because they've mistaken love for power. They want control, they want freedom from the unknown, the forces of the unknown, those painful, pesky, traumatic, energetic conflicts that we all have to go through, we all have to experience. So then, I've added my own commentary here, and this is my own interpretation of this dynamic. Hegel talked about it in his context. I've reframed it slightly, but it's still based on the same thing. And that is that the master-slave dynamic can be thought of as a general term, really, for all situations of contradiction that arise from not treating others the way we want to be treated, which, to be precise here, is ultimately to be free. And again, that's not freedom in the sense of just doing what you want willy-nilly. That's just this arbitrary freedom. That's not true freedom, because that's actually another kind of slavery. True freedom is, we're going to be getting onto that, but it's to do with self-determination in line with your true essence. And so that's what we're all aspiring to ultimately. The best and most complete form of freedom is actually working within your own limitations and, crucially, in equal harmony with the world around you. So it's not about like a kind of collectivism. This is not like what Marx took Hegel's philosophy and mangled it up and turned it into something else. No, it's actually honoring both sides. It's saying we are individuals, but in order to truly be individuals, we also have to honor each other as individuals. So it's not about collectivism. It's not about extreme, heedless, like selfishness either. It's actually the dialectic of the two. It is about individuation and self-knowledge, but it's doing that within the context of a state, to use Hegel's term, that supports that and that reflects that, actually. So I kind of think of the master-slave dynamic as a description, really, of how this general principle of coming to consciousness, this necessary stage, tends to play out in the kind of world that we have. So leading up to Hegel's day, and in history as Hegel knew it, he talked about the Lord-Bondsman dialectic. And he was, of course, aware of many other variations in which this same principle came about. But at its base, it's just the mind trying to assert itself the only way it knows how, and beyond a point, it also becomes willful, in that it just, on some level, it knows it's betraying freedom in general, let alone its own freedom, but it doesn't want to go there. So at that point, you have evil, essentially. Like we talked about the dissonance loops in a recent episode. We talked about how the mind trying to bend the absolute to its own particulars, trying to make the whole to itself. This is when it becomes very, very dissonant and self-contradictory to an extreme, even infinite extent. So beyond a point, that's what the master-slave dynamic can look like. But if you're doing things well, and if you're listening to your conscience and you're embodying empathy, then this will be a very transient stage of your development. Well, that said, it seems to be rather pervasive in today's world, I have to say. Hence why I got this image here of this sort of stern-looking guy in an office overlooking his subordinate who looks very glum and seems to be disappointed with him. So I'm going to make the case that the way that this master-slave dynamic shows up, many ways in today's world, between people in organized groups of all kinds, cults, whether they be spiritual, whether they be commercial, whether they be a family or a friendship group, but also in business and in the working world for a lot of people. Generally in organizations that don't value any kind of ethics and they just focus on one metric without any consideration to anything else. Like if it makes the number go up, jobs are good, apparently. But there's many organizations that don't think that way and don't work that way, but there are certainly many that do. And so even though in the office environment, the person is not being physically forced in quite the same way, because we have certain rights that are more recognized now in law, make no mistake, there is still behavior control going on. There's still legal ties that go on. There's still dishonesty. There's still information control that is often employed, like almost ubiquitously employed in a way to gain power in a situation. So in any interaction, it really helps to discern, like whether it's with a potential employer, potential client, a new contact that you're meeting. Am I being dragged into a kind of master-slave dynamic here? Whether very overtly, and most people who do this aren't doing this overtly, they're actually at least trying to be subtle about it. The truth is that if you are willing to see it, you'll see it no matter how subtle they try to make it, because it's aided primarily by your own unwillingness to see it. Like if you don't want to see it and you just want to get that job, or you fall in love with the idea of this person as a friend or a lover or a partner and refuse to see the reality and the mechanics that they're actually displaying to you, then the facade will not need to be very convincing. It will just need to be a token sort of nod in the direction of what you want to believe, and you'll lap it up as though it's truth until you create that consequence for yourself, enter into a dynamic, realize the unsustainability of it and the irony of it and the self-contradiction in it, and you'll eventually assimilate that and move on, if that's what you want to do and if you are embodying empathy in that process. But it doesn't matter what the tools of control and manipulation are. It's all master-slave dynamics if it's being done with the intention to gain power, right? Because there's dissonance, because there's a refusal to transform, aka a lack of empathy. Hence you have this dissonance loop. So when you encounter someone or an entity in the world, you can try and discern, like, are they trying to use me? Are they trying to drag me into a master-slave dynamic in some way? Regardless of what they say, if there's dissonance between what they say and what they do, or what they say 1 minute and what they say the next minute, then this should all raise question marks. Okay. So I want to go next to a quote by Michael Tsarin from his online article, Light, Magic and Masonry. So I'll just say he's talking in a slightly different context here. He's talking about the role of the left brain and in how it constructs and also deludes us in our experience of reality. But nonetheless, this particular passage is very relevant to what I'm saying here. So he said, what is really happening is that under the direction of the left brain, or ego, men have exchanged love for power, and by doing so, erect oppressive hierarchies of control in which one is bound to covet and crave increased power and dominance. Although this can be achieved by rising on one's merits, most men find it easier to simply push others down in order to feel high. Most modern hierarchies function in this malignant manner. In fact, they are deliberately designed to operate this way, to filter good moral men out, thereby enabling corrupt, immoral types to easily ascend to higher levels of world control. Hence the success of authoritarianism and prevalence of master-slave relationships on all levels and in all places. So, just by the way, Tsarin is a great thinker and content creator around German idealism. He has extensive content on the topic, including his Path of the Fall series, including many essays, including a couple of books, many books, at least a couple of which were devoted almost entirely to idealism. So, recommend checking out his content if you want to go deep and learn more about the philosophy. But I like this quote because it really echoes a lot of my own sentiments around the way modern work and institution are structured. Not only the way they happen to be, but the way they're actually intended to be from the inside out, whilst purporting to be something precisely otherwise. Remember the dissonance loop? So, in other words, the inflated ego, the power position, which beyond a point becomes a dissonance loop, believes that its power is actually a good thing. And this is, again, back to Schelling's idea about how this sort of template or memory of God or wholeness is carried through, and the derivative absolute of the individual is then using that to try and gain a feeling of wholeness, but not in a way that's aligned with the rest of reality, including the will of the self and other people, and also in a way that denies or attempts to bypass the work of that alignment of getting there, the hard, arduous, noble work of straightening out conflict, inner conflict. This is how history moves on. This is Hegel's dialectic. This is how things actually move and progress. It's not because conflict in itself is bad. It means that the synthesis, the way forward, comes from a sublation of the two. You take the truth from both sides, discard the falsity of both sides. That's how you realize the self. That's how all forms of truth come through. So this quote really echoes that, and I think in a way that's a very important thing to be pointing out, and in a way that is very perceptive of the inner workings of this and the motivation behind it. This is a reality that almost by default hardly anyone buys into, because so many of you are on the inside. You know, I've been on the inside. I still do work for organizations, and I have done several years in the corporate world, which is a very interesting experience. And I sort of stuck with it doggedly, even though there was many moments of enjoyment and success, and many moments of pain and struggle and failure as well. And but ultimately, the reason I was there was because I was learning so much about not just the workings of organizations, but human behavior in general. I mean, I was dealing with people at all levels, from CEOs all the way down to cleaners, and also many different kinds of industry and organizations within those industries. And even though I was employed by a very small organization, we were actually working with very large organizations. So I had a sort of cross-sectional view of all kinds of organization, really. And it was very sobering at times. I saw a lot of things I think many people outside of it would struggle to believe. So Georg Hegel said that it is only through staking one's life that freedom is won. The individual who has not risked his life may well be recognized as a person, but he has not attained to the truth of this recognition as an independent self-consciousness. This reminds me of this image on the previous slide here about these two guys in an office. So the little guy, looking down at his workbook there, he would appear to be someone who, like in Hegel's terms, hasn't yet risked his life. He's too invested, he's too bought into all his pressures and needs. He has a mortgage, maybe he has a couple of kids, he has a wife. Above all, he has a persona. He has an idea of himself that he just cannot bear to let go of. And maybe he's reaching his middle age at some point, who knows? And the pressure to let go of that is just becoming ever more painful and loud. And on one hand, the voice of the higher self, which also contains the shadow, by the way, light and dark aspects, is becoming louder and louder and louder, and the appeal of that is becoming louder. And meanwhile, the persona is becoming more and more refined in the sense of particular. It's becoming more and more like itself, or at least the appearance of itself, to the point where it's no longer the real thing. And this differential between appearances in actuality and the underlying reality is just becoming ever more stark and undeniable. I think of this as like this uncanny valley effect, where the more something becomes like itself and ever more particular, it doubles down on the thing that looks like the essence, well, the more it actually loses track of the real thing. There's this moment where it's suddenly like, whoa, it's like looking at a cartoon. It's no longer anything like the thing it pretends to be. It's just this like pure caricatural particular. And at that point in time, this poor guy here, he just cannot anymore deny it to himself. I mean, beyond the point, there's a kind of willful ignorance there, this sort of censorship or inhibition. And then there's sort of like a struggle and a denial and a bit of anger and frustration. And then beyond a point, it just becomes completely dissonant. Like beyond the point, it has to become an active, self-willed ignorance to the point of complete, bizarre self-contradiction. Now, hopefully most of you aren't pushing it that hard, but God knows there are many folks in this world who do, and that's basically become their life now. That's why we have the dissonance loop. Now, we all get stuck in dissonance, but there does come a point where meaningfully, like you can think of actually an entire life has been defined by this sub-ambulation of the persona, right? What the person has identified with. This is the cause of all personality disorders, guys. This is how it happens. This is how it works. And the reason there's a kind of threshold there, I think relates to this master-slave dynamic. It's a similar kind of idea. But whilst this is a dynamic that we must all go through in various facets of our lives, there's also a phenomena where basically the person chooses that they'd rather die than let go of that dynamic. They'd rather let life itself pass them by than brave the necessary work to actually live it fully. In other words, they value the self-image more than life itself, despite the fact that one can't exist without the other. The self-image cannot exist without life. So immediately there you're seeing the first contradiction. That's one dissonance. And once you do one, the rest just ever more down the chain. Every single thing they think, say, or do contains that very same dissonance in some form. So, moving on then, let's go to one last quote from Hegel. He said that the one is independent and its essential nature is to be for itself. The other is dependent and its essence is life or existence for another. The former is the master or lord, the latter the bondsman. So this is essentially just corroborating things that I've already said, just a description of the dialectic there. So just some final comments here then. So this master-slave dynamic, or this Lord-Bondsman dialectic, the way Hegel described it is as an example of how he understood it in his time. But Hegel, perhaps more than anyone else, understood the universality of what he was conveying in his philosophy. So I think we can safely say that this is a dialectic that clearly shows up in all manner of ways, and we see it in new forms in today's world. And summarising with a key theme here, freedom takes many forms and must be pursued in many areas. And I think a pretty useful way to think about the areas in which freedom needs to be pursued is simply the four modalities model, i.e. the four modalities of consciousness. And this is an idea that appears in all kinds of spiritual traditions, right? So fire, water, air, earth, the four elements. It shows up in the Buddhist five aggregates, which are form, feeling, perception, volition, and consciousness itself. So it's like you got four modalities plus consciousness in which they're experienced. It shows up symbolically in the form of four-pronged mandalas, such as the Christian cross and various other ones around the world. So these are essentially the four ways in which we can experience reality and ourselves, is through these four modalities. And this means, therefore, that materiality or sensation, this physical world, which includes the world of finance and commerce and livelihood and so on, this is one area in which freedom ought to be pursued. This is one area in which we can be both enslaved by ourselves and others, where we can get engaged in master-slave dynamics. And by the same token, it's an area where we can achieve great freedom. So this is one of the more undifferentiated areas in the wider discourse of freedom, with one camp more or less maybe believing that money and finance is wrong or evil or diabolical in some way, and the opposite camp almost just throwing caution to the wind and saying, smash the resistance, man, stamp out your guilt. You need to feel nothing guilty about making money in any way or means possible. And both of these are equally misguided. The truth is that it lies in the middle somewhere, and that there is something potentially and intrinsically noble about generating value in the world, creating contribution. We're going to be talking about that in a future episode here. This is what I refer to as habit 4, which is to contribute your unique and specific value. So this is absolutely part of the road to self-knowledge. where you are unfree physically and materially, it is also giving some clues as to the nature of your mind, or at least the state of your mind in its current state. It means there's work to be done there. Now, it doesn't mean that we will all have infinite resources forever. In fact, it's actually also about recognizing limitation. Another key theme here about the nature of freedom, of course, is that it contains limitation. Freedom is just not boundless movement and heedless creation without limitation. There's no such thing. It's actually about recognizing limitation and working within it. And within that, also resolving it, sublacing it, and expanding it. So that said, I'm going to leave that there. I trust you found that useful, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. But before I go, I'll just again remind you of the Know Yourself program. This is my series of 5 self-study courses. So if you'd like to delve deeper into the 7 habits of individuation, including habits around contribution and work, that's all in the final course, which is called The Way of Individuation. So feel free to check that out at knowyourself.makeitconscious.com, and I'll see you soon.